Ready? Ready, PK? Hello, and welcome to another author event at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today the Poison Pen is delighted to have with us a trio of talented authors, Christina Dodd, Liana de la Rosa, and Dianne Freeman. Before we begin today, if you're tuning in virtually, the Poison Pen does have a limited number of signed copies of our authors' newest books. If you'd like one, please give us a call or go online after the program. We'll put one in the mail or hold one for you to pick up here at the store. Now I'd like to welcome Christina, Liana, and Dianne.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
There you go. Okay, my first question for you is, each of you had a life before you became an author, and some of you had rather fascinating lives. So what can you tell us about that past life? Why don't we start with you, Liana, actually, because I think there was pecans in your past.
There was. So after I graduated college, I'm a Wildcat. I graduated from the University of Arizona. I thought I was going to be an attorney, and I took a year off before going to law school. And then I didn't go to law school. And then I thought I was going to be a teacher. And then I wasn't a teacher. And I stumbled into selling pecans for a very large farm south of Tucson. If any of you are familiar with Southern Arizona, there's a Green Valley Pecan Company. I worked for them for several years. So when I say I sold nuts, like I legitimately sold nuts. And it was a great job. I loved working for them. It was a family business, and I learned so much about agriculture and being out in the land and being a good steward of the land. And so once I had children, I started to stay home, and then my alter ego as a romance writer was born.
Dianne, what about you?
Mine is definitely not the fascinating story at all. And I won't go back as far as college, but I worked for 30 years as an accountant, a corporate accountant. Did financials, things of that nature. And you can only be so creative in that field before you get into a lot of trouble, and you could end up in prison. So kind of a career standard was to have a hobby that was either very creative or very physical, because there's also a lot of sitting in accounting. And I always wrote. So that was just a thing I would do. I would just write what I now would call first drafts. Then it was just, I thought I was writing the whole story, right? And when I was done, get rid of it and start reading again, you know. And anytime I didn't find what I wanted to read, I would just go ahead and write it. And okay, I'm done with that one now. And that went on for years and years and years. And then when I retired, my husband was already retired. He was golfing, and I took the first year to just do whatever I wanted to do. And I thought, well, what if I actually tried to revise one of these stories and make it something that maybe somebody would like to read? And so that I launched into that. It took me a couple of years, and then the rest is my writing history.
Christina?
I was a draftsman. I designed roads, mines, and sawmills. Did it until my first daughter was born, and then I told my husband I'm going to quit and write a book, because how much trouble can one little baby be? Which is why it was 10 years, 2 kids and 3 manuscripts before I was published. But it taught me a lot about writing. It taught me a lot about starting with, because I used with the sawmills, sincerely, we did sawmills. They would start with a plot plan. There was just bare ground, and then we would do the plot, and we would design the building, and we would design the machinery inside, and it took years. And it taught me about starting from page 1, and it's going to be a really long time till you get to the last page, and actually making it work. And it's kind of writing is kind of structural, so it's very interesting. It's helped a lot. Plus, it taught me a lot about men.
Which came in handy when you wrote romances.
Yes, it did. It always comes in handy, John.
Let's talk a little bit about your book that brought you here, Liana. That's the second in your Luna Sisters series.
So, Isabel and the Rogue is the second book in my Latinx Victorian sister series, or Victorian romance series called The Luna Sisters. It's about three sisters who flee their home in Mexico City when the French invade in the 1860s, and they take refuge in London and then take society by storm. And each book follows one of the sisters. So, book 2 is about Isabel Luna, who is the middle sister. And by middle sister, I mean like middle sister, like Jan Brady, middle sister, who very much feels overshadowed by her very charismatic older sister and her like beautiful and fiery younger sister. And she's very reserved and shy and the bookworm of the family. She's very much also the dark-skinned sister. And I really wanted to, touch on colorism in Latino communities. And so Isabel is the one who looks like their indigenous roots. And so it was a lot of fun to be able to write in an era, the Victorian era, that I am passionate about and that I love, but incorporate history that's maybe outside of the Eurocentric lens that we often read about in historical romances. And I'm writing about people who look like me with my cultural history. And Isabel was a challenge. I wasn't quite sure what to expect from her because in the first book, like I said, I kind of viewed her like a Jan Brady character until I actually started writing her story. And she's pretty amazing in my own words. She's just like she may be reserved, but she's brave and loyal. And I really loved getting to write her story and more importantly, her happy ever after. So Isabel and the Road came out in the beginning of June.
Diane, what about your new book, Art Lover's Guide to Murder in Paris?
Okay, let's see. So Frances and George got married in February, and now it's July, and they still haven't been on a honeymoon. So when George gets a letter from France, she figures it must be an assignment, and she wants to go too. Like, okay, you are not going to Paris without me. There's all this going on. The World Exposition of 1900 was happening. The second modern Olympics was happening. It was just a really big thing. And she says, you're not going without me. So then she finds out what the actual assignment is. And George has an aunt that we kind of heard a little bit about in book 6, that the whole family thought she was just traveling the world for the past 8 years. And in truth, she's been living in Paris the whole time. And George is the only one who knows that. So when she had a problem, he's the only one she could call on. And the problem is that a friend of hers has died. The police put it as an accident, and she thinks he was murdered. So she wants George and Frances to check it out. Of course, George takes Frances with her. She's not going to let him go alone. And when they talk to George's aunt, Julia, she's kind of backpedaling now. She's like, I don't know. And she seems very wary, and they're very concerned that she's just, I don't know, she's afraid to tell them what actually happened. So before they get the information out of her, she too is killed. So now they have to dig into her secrets because she's got a lot of secrets and find out what happened to her and is it tied to what happened to him. So.
Christina, you start a new series with your new book?
It is a new series. It's called the Daughter of Montague series. I have an entirely separate website for that, so you're welcome to go there and read about it. What happened was I was talking to my daughter, Arwen, and I said, I'm looking for an idea that is like a spinoff of a well-known concept like Pride and Prejudice and zombies. And she said, the daughter of Romeo and Juliet. And I said, Romeo and Juliet are dead. And then I
so many ways.
They were never alive. It's fiction. And actually, Eloisa James, who's Mary Bligh, she's a Shakespearean scholar. She expounded to me about how Shakespeare wasn't the first one to write the story. Apparently, he's like the third one to write the story. And so a spinoff is probably okay for him. And I sat down and I started writing the book, and she came to me immediately. They didn't actually die in the tomb. Rumors of their death were greatly exaggerated, and she was conceived immediately. They have a large family. They're very much in love with each other. They are Romeo and Juliet, and she's a 19-year-old, and they've been trying to marry her off since she was 13, because that was when her mother got married, and she's been very cleverly dodging this, arranging other matches for these guys, and she's like a 19-year-old who's got famous parents. Everybody knows about Romeo and Juliet. Everybody knows they are famous lovers. Everybody thinks that Juliet is gorgeous and Romeo is handsome, and she's just like, it makes her roll her eyes. And so she's a fun character. She came to me immediately, and I wrote the first 4 pages, and then I said, nobody's ever going to buy this, so I put it down. Do you want me to continue? So then Susan Elizabeth Phillips and Jane Ann Krentz and I are friends, and we email back and forth quite a bit, and after we'd been amusing each other, Susan Phillips, who wrote rom-com, wrote me and said, you're funny. You should try and write a rom-com. And I wrote back sarcastically and said, yes, of course, that's a brilliant idea. I wrote historical romance, contemporary romance, romantic suspense, and suspense. I should definitely go to another genre. That's just, and so then I thought of this book, and I wrote it back, and I said, how do you write romantic suspense, rom-com? And she wrote back, and she goes, well, number 1, boy and girl meet. Number 2, boy and girl fall in love. Number 3, boy and girl have problems and make funnies and live happily ever after. And then she said, duh. So I wrote her back, and I said, if it's that easy, why don't you write faster? And so I gave her a little idea of the concept, and then I called Jane Ann Krentz, and I said, and Jane, who's very forceful and directs my life, said, send us the pages. And I did. And they're the reason I wrote the book, because they both said, you've got to write this book. And this is it.
Let's talk a little bit. Each of you are writing historicals in one sense or another. Historical mystery, historical romance, historical romantic comedy. People think that you can just make things up in fiction, and you do. But with history, you have to have some grounding in that time period. So can you talk a little bit about your time period for your book, what research you've done, and what you've discovered about that particular time period that surprised you the most? Why don't we start with you, Dianne?
Okay, that's a lot.
Yeah.
I basically wanted to write this book because I wanted to go to Paris, and the timing was during the pandemic, and so they got married, George and Francis. I wanted to send them on a honeymoon, and we were still in the pandemic, so I said, well, I can't go anywhere. They can't go anywhere. So I waited and wrote another book, and then finally 2022 came along, and I'm like, okay, I can go somewhere now. What's going on in 1900? Where should I go? I was hoping it would be France, but as it turned out, yes, they were having the great exposition of 1900. The one they had in 89 was where the 1889 was where the Eiffel Tower came into being. And in 1900, they were just all set to do it again. They were really practiced in this. I didn't know at the same time that they were also hosting the Olympics that year. And most people did not know. This is the one thing that I learned, is they had to kind of weigh their money, I suppose. Where do you put your budget? And they knew that the exposition was a moneymaker. People were flocking to this. And other countries contributed as well. They had the Avenue of Nations along the embankment of the Seine, where everybody put up their own buildings and brought their art and industry to show off. The Olympics was another story. It was sport. It was only the second time. It was kind of like untried. They weren't sure how that would go. So with a lot of people who ended up competing in the Olympics did not know they were competing in the Olympics. They just thought it was another golf tournament or a swimming match, something like that. And they had no idea until they got whatever award they were handed at the time if they won. But it was a weird thing for me because, oh, yes, I wanted to travel. I wrote my outline. My editor approved it. I was all excited, and then I went, wait a minute, I don't really know anything about French history. And I can't bring, when you write a series, you can use a lot of the same characters in the next book. You bring them along. So-and-so's sister, so-and-so's aunt, that type of thing. They're there. I had to create all new characters for this because they couldn't all go to Paris with George and Francis. So that was difficult. It was kind of very much like writing book one all over again because everybody was new and I had to kind of feel out who they are. And then they were French. So I don't know. Now I'm kind of meandering, but the research I did was I did kind of minute by minute schedule my trip to Paris with guides who were also historians and could kind of recreate that era for me. And it's amazing because only 3 buildings and 1 bridge remain from what they built for that whole 280 acres worth of World's Fair. Everything else that they built, huge Palace of Electricity, the Chateau d'Eau, these wonderful structures. They're gorgeous. Just tore them all down at the end of November when the show was over. And what remains was what we now have as the Musée d'Orsay. It was a train station that kind of brought people closer to Paris. I think Gare du Nord was the closest before that, and that was a little too far away at the time. And then the Grand Palais, which if you get a chance to go to Paris soon, it has just opened again after being closed for like 5 years, a long time. And I've seen pictures and it just kills me that it wasn't open when I was there. It is so beautiful. And then across the street from that is the Petit Palais, which is also fabulous. And then right outside that is the Alexander III Bridge, which is just, in my opinion, the most beautiful bridge in Paris. So I learned a lot about the exposition. I learned a lot about French history. And there's just a little bit of it in the book because you never use as much as you actually have to research. And that's about it.
Yeah, that was good. Liana, what about you? Because what I love about the Luna Sisters books is I don't think people realize that Mexico was occupied during their history.
France colonized Mexico for about 7 years in the 1860s. And I was actually looking at immigration records for another character in another project, and I came across records of Mexicans moving to Europe. And I started to wonder what that was about and why they would be doing that. And it was like all of a sudden I remembered, oh my goodness, the French occupation. And the only reason I could say, oh my goodness, and like remember it is because I had studied history as an undergrad, and I had taken several Mexican history courses, and I saved all those textbooks from way back when.
Oh, wow.
So I could finally turn to my husband and be like, you remember all those old textbooks I lugged from every house that we lived in? Well, look, I'm going to actually use them now. And they were invaluable because I am Mexican-American, I'm also Puerto Rican, but I am not fluent in Spanish. And a lot of the resources in Mexico obviously are in Spanish. And Mexico actually has really wonderfully kept archives to dive into that I have had friends who have assisted me with like the research of that. But I also had these old textbooks that I could rely upon to use. And I was lucky enough that I had specific ones that pertain to Juarez and Maximilian. Juarez was the democratically elected president of Mexico at the time of the occupation. Maximilian was an archduke who was tapped by Napoleon III to be the emperor of Mexico. And spoiler, he was the last emperor of Mexico. His execution ended the war. And so it was really challenging because I am kind of a history nerd just for my own gratification. And so I wanted to put all this detail about this time into the book. And my editor's really wonderful because she'd be like, this is fascinating. This is so cool. I love learning this. But we're going to have to cut all of this because I write romance, right? So the central romance is the focus of the story. And I'm like, I know, but this is, like you said, it's like really cool. And I wanted to share it with somebody. So like you, there was, only so much that could be added into the story. And it was kind of challenging because not only was I having to pay attention to what was happening in London, and whatever year the story was set, I had to also be aware of what was happening in Mexico and how to tie that together because the sisters are the daughters of a powerful Mexican politician. So they are very invested in what is happening back home in Mexico. And so it was kind of walking a tightrope sometimes to what information can I add, what pushes the story forward, what is just superfluous. And so that was a bit of a challenge. And you asked about something I learned that I hadn't known before. So this comes up specifically in Isabel and the Rogue, and she's kind of the mouthpiece for it. And if you've read the book, and I discuss it in the author's note, there is a theory that some historians have that the French would have supported the Confederacy if they were not so busy fighting Juarez and his supporters in Mexico. I think that they underestimated the sort of pushback that they were going to get by coming in because they were very much supported by a powerful faction within Mexico who wanted European rule, essentially. I'm very much condensing this down. But I think they underestimated the sort of pushback that they were going to get. And so Juarez and his supporters were, they really fought very hard against it, and they kept the French very busy. And so there's this idea that some historians have that if they had not done that, then the French may have been at liberty to supply the Confederacy with more funds, whether that was for weapons or whatever, because there was this belief in Europe that the Confederates were much more genteel, right? They had that more of like propriety that, Europeans so like. And so there was this belief that perhaps, the Americans needed that sort of influence. And so if the French had been at liberty to intercede or to, support the Confederacy, what would we look like now? How would have, United States history have been different? And so Isabel in the book kind of gives voice to this theory. And I just thought that was really amazing. And I kind of like to think about that, like, wow. And how much, world history is intertwined, right? How something that's happening in Mexico could so greatly happen what was happening here in the United States and happening in other places in the world. And that was one small thing I kind of fought for in the book. Like, I really want to just throw this theory that some people have proposed out there because I thought it was really fascinating.
That is fascinating. I think there's also the belief that the British might have landed in the Confederacy camp if things had been different too. There. Christina, Shakespeare invented his play, but you had to ground it in reality. What kinds of research did you do?
The first thing when I decided to write the book, I Googled, when did Romeo and Juliet take place? And they basically said between the 13th and the 15th century. So we know where it's set, but that's a lot of time. That's the late medieval period into the early Renaissance period, and what was happening in Italy in those days. So I kind of said, well, I can do it like Shakespeare and fake my way through this. And I know an incredible lot now, of course, but I was not true to the timeline. I didn't make sure that all the events are correct. It's you're not going to want to read this for historical context. The thing that I really enjoyed doing the research for, and that I know is absolutely correct, is the food, which of course I like to do research on food. We watched, my poor husband, he watched so much Shakespeare. He watched so many Shakespeare documentaries. He saw, plays. Oh my God. But also one of the things we did was we watched a documentary called Food History by Ken Alballo, a food historian. And it's on the Great Courses. And it's like 25-hour things. Oh no, it's food all the way through, not just Renaissance. It is food all the way through. And he's very interesting, actually. But the main thing you have to remember with this this period. 1492 is when the New World was discovered, and all of the food that was in the New World was not
In Europe.
in Europe.
Yeah.
So, okay, think of Italian food. There's no tomatoes. There's no corn. There's no polenta. There's no potatoes. Gnocchi. I mean, it's just they called stuff like that there, but it was made with different things, barley, etc. A lot of fruit, a lot of meat, and bread and cheese and wine. So it was fascinating research, and I enjoy myself thoroughly. And I could go on for a long time and really bore you to death, but I won't. Yeah, really.
What did you discover about that time period that surprised you?
Oh, it was the food. That was what I was looking at. It was just like, wow, this is fabulous stuff. But the main thing you have to remember with Romeo and Juliet is that Shakespeare probably, everybody pretty much believes he never left England, never left Great Britain. Traveled there extensively, of course, because he was a playwright and a player, but he totally faked it. And it's, so going to Verona, we went to Verona, I'm sorry. Do you want me to do this one now?
Sure.
My husband and I celebrated an extremely large anniversary last year. And so we went to Italy and just so I could do research afterwards. And we went to Verona for 5 days. Really a great city. I recommend it. It's extremely walkable, has a lot of antiquity there. So many balconies. You would not believe the number of balconies on these buildings. They're like everywhere. I took pictures all over. It's a great little town. If you go to Italy, I suggest visiting because and the food's great.
Let's talk a little bit about how you approach writing your books, because that varies from author to author. And I know depending on if you're doing a mystery, you might want more structure. Historical romance might allow you more leeway. But talk about your writing process, and why don't we start with you, Christina?
My writing, I've been published for 34 years. My writing process, and I was not published for 10 years before that, so my writing process continually changes. It depends on the book. With this book, I just sat down and wrote it through. I did plotting, but Rosie is a very clear character in my mind, and because I was writing first person, I was able to just write like that. If any of you are on my newsletter list, that's who she sounds like. She sounds like me when I'm writing a newsletter to you. So this one was just straight through, but I mean, I have written synopses first. I have written off the seat of my pants. I've written one book I wrote to like page 50, and then I had a bunch of angst I had to write. I didn't want to write it, so I went to like the middle of the book and I started writing, and then I still didn't want to go back, and so eventually I finished the book, and then I went back between like 50 and page 120 and filled it in, and I basically wrote the book backwards. Nobody ever knew. And that's, to me, the thing is writing's constantly evolving, and you want to, as long as you're getting words on the page, you're doing it right. If any of you write, that's what you need to remember. I don't care who tells you any different. They're wrong, and I'm right. You do it your way.
Liana, what about you? Because this is the second in your trilogy. Did you know when you were starting out there's going to be 3 books, each is going to be a sister? Because you kind of have to plan for things so they interconnect.
And I'm a plantser, which means I plot and then I write on by the seat of my pants. So I had to plan out the series to a certain extent. So when I pitched the series to editors, I knew that it would be 3 books. I knew that one book would focus on each sister, and I kind of knew like tropes and like I could give an elevator pitch about like what each of the books would be about. And an elevator pitch is like a sentence or 2 about the book. And then I usually write a synopsis, which I don't know if we have any writers here. You either hate them or you hate them. And I am one of those people that I actually like them. Only because it's the very first time I get to take the story that's in my head and write it down. So I'm telling the story to myself for the first time, because I think about it a lot before I actually start putting words on the page. I'm always thinking about it. So when I actually get to sit down and like do it, it's the first time I get to kind of figure out if it's going to work, the parts that I want to write, any scenes that stand out to me. And once I'm done with that, I send it to my editor or my agent for like approval. They give their feedback, and then I start writing. And here's the thing: I might not follow that synopsis at all. It might be totally different because I might start writing and just kind of go where the characters take me or where the story takes me. But I have to write that synopsis first. Like I have to get what I thought the story was going to be on the page. And I would say I follow a synopsis maybe like 80%, 85%. So it's there. But there's no scenes. There's no anything like that, because if I know what's going to happen next, I get bored. I don't want to write it because I already know. So I just need like an overview of what's going to happen. And then the fun part is like discovering with the characters what's going to happen. It was easier with Isabel because I had already done a lot of the research. So I already kind of knew what I was playing with. I already had a lot of sand in my sandbox to like play with to write her story. I will say for book 3, it features the youngest sister, Gabriela, Gabby. And I will say that was harder because a large portion of the story doesn't take place in England. That's a spoiler. It doesn't take place in England. So I had to like do more research to figure it out. And I've learned that I cannot do the research until after I write my first draft, because I mentioned that I am like a history nerd. And I also don't like writing first drafts. I don't know about you guys. I hate writing first drafts. I hate a blank page. I find them very stressful and intimidating. So I'm trying to like write as fast as I can just so I have words on the page that I can play with in revisions. So for me, I just got to power through that first draft. I set a timer and I'm like, Liana, you can write for 15 minutes. You can do it. You can do it. And I write whole books in 15 or 20-minute sprints. And then once I have a draft I can work with, I can then do the research I need to do to fill in the blanks, because by then I already know you need to figure out this, how long was this voyage, or what would they have eaten, during this dinner party, or whatever the case may be. And then I can specifically look for those details, because if I had free reign, I would look for those details and then fall into another research rabbit hole that had nothing to do with my book. And then because I don't like writing that first draft, I would never write it because I would just be researching. So with my way, I know I have to just research this stuff. And then because I already have a draft to work with, then I get to have fun making it better and playing with the characterizations and the sentence structure, and, whatever. I enjoy that part of it because in my mind, I did the hard work. I put words on the page. Now I get to have fun. So,
Do you ever write yourself into a corner?
Thankfully, no. Not yet.
That's my fear, because I'm always afraid I'm going to write myself into a corner.
Not yet. Okay, now that I said that, I'm going to totally do that in the next book. But here's the thing. Maybe because I don't mind revisions. So if that happens and I don't really know where to go, I don't mind sending it to like a beta, like a friend, or even my editor, and being like, help me out because I don't know what to do. Like, I did this, help me out. And then once I have direction, I'm like, oh, okay, then I can just rewrite and restructure it. And sometimes I've had to Frankenstein a draft, where you cobble it together from like old drafts. And it's always like panic-inducing when I realize the work that's cut out for me, but I always feel so good when I'm done. Like, oh, I did it. I, managed to piece it all together in a way that works. But yeah, not yet. I haven't done that yet. Let's hope it doesn't happen.
Dianne, what about you? What's your writing process? And you're up to book 7. Did you ever imagine when you were starting out you'd have to put that many plots together?
No, I never did. I thought I was writing one book. And then when I was offered a 3-book contract, I went, oh, God, can I even do this? And then it just goes on from there. So it's something I really enjoy. I kind of like all of it. I like drafting, and then I like editing, too. I do a outline because my editor wants an outline. And I have still written myself into a corner, because later on a beta reader will go, well, that's not possible. It's like, how did I not know that? So then I've got to write myself out of it. But I'll do an outline, and then I'll start drafting. And like for this book, because it was a new location and new characters, and new law, Code Napoleon. I wasn't familiar with that, and I didn't know how police operated, and so I had a lot. I will get through that first draft, and I'll just leave myself notes. You've got to figure this out. You got to find out about that. How does this work? And back to your other question about things that surprised me, I was surprised at how much, I guess, criminal investigation kind of came from France. With Vidocq, who was one of the first detectives who was actually a criminal, and he was arrested so many times that they're like, we could probably use some of your ideas, and he ended up being, I think the first, well, I don't know about the first prefect de police, but he was one of them. And then another one that really surprised me was Bertillon, who was just a clerk at the police station, and he got bored one day, so he started, they were already using, this is probably late 80s, maybe 1890s, and they were already using cameras to take mugshots, and he started thinking, well, you can kind of change your physical appearance to some degree. So when they were booking somebody, I'm sure they didn't call it that, but he would take measurements, and he started working in that, and then it just became a thing. And I don't remember what they were called, but they would go with the mugshot, and there were like 32 different measurements, like from the bridge of your nose to your hairline, that type of thing, and from your tip of your nose to your ear, how far away that, things you could not change about yourself, so that when they were rearresting somebody, like, okay, this is your 5th offense, and they would know that regardless of the fact that the person changed his name 5 times. And so then anyway, so yeah, I would go down, I write my first draft, I go down these little rabbit holes, find out my answers, and then I start editing, which I really love, just kind of massaging it. That's when I feel like I know the characters after that first draft. And when you're starting with all new characters, which you guys do all the time, I can't believe that. That's wild. You have to get to know them first. So by the second draft, I know them. I know what they're going to do. I know how they're going to respond to things. So I just keep drafting until my editor says it's due, and then I turn it in.
Let's pivot directions a little bit and talk about each of you as readers, because before you were writers, you were readers. So who were some of the authors, the books, that kind of influenced you, that you found to be touchstones in your own writing life? Are there newer authors that you can't wait to read their new book? Start with you, Dianne.
Yeah, there's a lot of people I can't wait to read their new book. As far as influence, I want to say the first time I ever realized there was such a thing as historical mystery was, oh gosh, I'm going to forget her name. I can't believe this. Murder in
what's the color of
Kensington
the
Gardens.
Anne Perry.
Anne Perry,
Yeah.
that was it. I think I was, I had surgery or something of that nature, and I was just laid up for a while and needed to read, and so I found one of her books and read it, and it was probably like book 18. And I got done with it, and I went, oh my God, I've got 17 more books to read. But I was wrong. There was probably about 25 at that time. So the whole time I was healing, I'm reading Anne Perry, and I went back to the Cater Street Hangman and went on from there, and that is when I found the genre of my heart, historical mystery. It was wonderful. And some of the other ones, certainly Rhys Bowen and Jackie Winspear were big influences. I've got both Jackie's newest book, and I'm waiting to read that. But as far as newer books, I've just finished, I'm going to forget this name too, but every time I go on vacation, someone dies.
Yeah.
Catherine.
Can't remember the author, but it's brand new.
And it's a pseudonym anyway, but a lot of fun, a really fun book. Murder in Highbury. I just read an advance copy of that. Yes. Yeah, she was at ALA with you. Yeah. By Vanessa Kelly. And that's coming out this fall, and that's going to be a fun one too. So I read a lot of nonfiction. So nowadays when I read fiction, I tend to want to read something that's more fun and upbeat.
Liana?
So Historical romance was my gateway into romance as a genre overall, and it will always be my first love. And I think that romances by Sarah MacLean, Courtney Milan, Lisa Kleypas, which I heard it's not Kleypas, it's Kleypas,
Wow.
right? I didn't think so either, but she she was like Miss Massachusetts, like in the Miss America pageant or whatever, and she introduced herself as Kleypas, and I was like, what? When I know her. I don't know her. Do you know her? So it's Kleypas? Kleypas. Okay, well, Kleypas for me too. Lisa Kleypas, my God, I think I would cry if I met her. So definitely Lisa Kleypas is those were all really big influences when I was first starting out writing. But there's a lot of my peers who are just so talented. Yes. Where I'm like, I like you so much, but also I hate you. How do you do that? It's like magic. That's true. Like Minerva Spencer is just phenomenal. She writes beautiful historicals, very steamy. She's fantastic. She also has a pseudonym, S.M. Laviolette.
Yeah.
Yes, she's fantastic. Joanna Lowell released a new book recently called
her
A Sure
new book
Thing.
is so wonderful. Seaweed. Who thought?
It's just fantastic. It's called
Victorian.
A Sure Thing, Victorian, set on the beach. A trans male character. She's a botanist. It's so lovely and tender and just beautiful. And I know that Scarlett Peckham has a new book out called The Mistress Experience that I definitely want to read. Historical romance over the last few years, readership has been down, and we can talk about all the reasons why that it's been down. But I will say that I think the genre as a whole is still doing the hard work. They're still tackling a lot of issues that are relevant even today and doing it so beautifully. And I think some of the best writers who are writing romance now write historical romance. And I hope it has another heyday, not just because I write it, but because I am very passionate about it.
Christina?
Jane Ann Krantz. Long before I met her, I was reading her. I can remember I worked in the bookstore, and I said I really like Stephanie Lawrence, and what was one of the other ones?
For historicals?
No, Stephanie James. And she used to have all kinds of pseudonyms. Jane Taylor. I mean, I said I really like these two authors, and they said,
Sandra
it's the
Brown.
same.
Sandra Brown.
Yeah.
No?
No.
I don't know. We'll go on.
And we could ask Jane. She's supposed to be watching, but I said I looked at these two writers, and they said it's the same person, and so pretty soon I find out she's writing with 5 different names, and I'm reading them all. She was really my main influence. Susan Elizabeth Phillips, of course, for the comedy. Just Lisa, and I read everything except mystery. I read, but the mystery 40 years ago was less interesting in my opinion. Now there's a lot.
We can agree to disagree, but go on.
Yeah, go ahead. Now it's more character driven.
Yes, I think it has moved in that direction.
But you also read Agatha Christie, and I mean, my God, the plots. Oh, jeez. But I always read contemporary. Mostly I read romance. I really liked romance. I mean, contemporary and historical and everything else. And the reason why I wrote historical for so long was because that was the first thing I got published. And once you got published in that direction, you had to stick with it. And then, but I had already written my second unpublished book is contemporary romance, and so I eventually went back and started writing that, and then the paranormal popped up, and then I don't. Anyway, but it's basically I like to read it all. I really enjoy it immensely, and I agree. There's so many good books out now. I don't know how people have time to read and get it all in there. One of the things about having a bookstore like this is that you walk in and you say, this is what I read, and they hand you the right books. And that's what's so wonderful. That's what you can't get on Amazon or any of the online bookstores. And I'm grateful for that.
Thank you. The next question I have, you can answer as much or as little as you'd like, because I know sometimes authors are a little bit proprietary, but what's next from you? And we'll start with you, Christina.
I have suspense coming out in March, and it's called Girl Anonymous. And then I have the second one of this series coming out, and I'm just now announcing the title, which is Thus With the Kiss I Die. Think Hamlet.
Liana?
The third Luna Sisters book about youngest sister Gabby, or Gabriela, is out next summer. And then I don't know quite yet. I'm working on what's next. So hopefully I'll have news to share within the next few months.
Dianne?
The next book that's coming out is number 8. It's also set in Paris. And trying to think, it's a working title right now, but right now we're thinking it's A Daughter's Guide to Mothers and Murder. So we'll see how that goes. But there's there's so many mothers and mother figures in this book. Okay. And let's see. George and Frances get involved in solving this crime because it's actually a cold case. A woman was murdered back in January. This is now September. And the police haven't had a decent clue for 6 months. But then suddenly they have a clue. The deceased had some jewelry stolen, and somebody sent an earring and a note that says, "I know what you did," to none other than Sarah Bernhardt.
Oh.
And the police this is like too hot a potato for them to handle. And that's how George gets involved, because nobody wants to be the police officer who arrests the divine Sarah Bernhardt.
Are you having so much fun researching her? She's like Madonna of
She is just so quirky and amazing. And yeah, I've got a bunch of her biographies, and they all have little sticky notes in like almost every page. It's amazing. I went to her theater. It has been rehabbed now. So that was really awesome.
I think we have some time for any questions you might have for our authors. Now's your chance. No questions? You're all dumbstruck? No? Okay.
How did you each get discovered? Did you go through an agent? Did you go through many agents, query like crazy, or did you luck out and be at the right place at the right time and meet somebody?
I can
Let's
start
start.
because mine's kind of an interesting story. And it's a little bit of all of that. I had said I was massaging a story into something that I thought people might read. And I heard about a competition called Pitch Wars, which doesn't exist anymore, sadly. They do have some various romance versions of that, but this was any genre. And you submit a sample of your writing and a query letter, and you may get picked or you may get not. And if you get picked, which I did, you are going to have a mentor. And I think it was for 60 days that you just worked and you did another revision of this, and you revised your pitch, which it's just a 50-word pitch. So like the elevator pitch, something to sell that book right away. At the end of that 60 days, how did this work? The pitch and the first page goes on display. So there's a web page where here's the title of the manuscript, who wrote it, the finished length, just a few details about the manuscript, and then the pitch and the first page. And from there, agents will decide whether or not they want to see any more. So you'll get requests. So instead of subbing to an agent, it's just like right there, they're asking you for it. And through that, I did find my agent. And through my agent, we revised once again. And then she subbed it to Kensington, and my first editor who read it bought it. So it's kind of right place, and I think that's hugely important to remember. Sometimes it's just luck, but you keep trying and your luck gets better.
Liana?
I queried the old-fashioned way. I looked up who represented historical romance, and I sent out query letters, and in the middle of querying, I racked up, I don't want to brag, but I had a lot of rejections. And in the middle of querying, I had been entering contests. At the time, this was circa, oh gosh, when was this? 2016. You could enter writing contests, and you would submit like a certain part of your manuscript, and they would judge it, and they would give you feedback. And if you won, some of the like final round judges were like editors at certain publishing houses, or they were agents or whatever. Well, my book happened to place, and the editor who was like the final round judge really loved the book, and she asked me if she could read the full thing and submit it to her. And I did, and they offered to buy it, and I did that without an agent. I sold that first book, but then they wanted additional books in the series, and I was like, well, I need an agent for that. So I went out and queried again, but this time I had a book deal right in my back pocket. And I still got some rejections from that too. But I did find my current agent, who I've been with since then. And she's wonderful. It's really nice to have someone in your corner. And she has been with me. I had several projects that we sent out. It's called being on submission, where you send them out to like editors at different publishing houses. I had several, story ideas and books that went on submission that were not picked up. A lot of them were historical romances that were not set in Europe. They were set elsewhere. And I'm sure if you know the genre, a lot of people are like, oh yeah, because yeah. So I happen to, like you said, a lot of it's luck. I happened to have the Luna Sister series ready to go. And what happened right before we went on submission? First season of Bridgerton came out. Oh. So suddenly, editors were looking for diverse historical romances. And I just so happened to have a series ready to go. And so it went super fast. But you couldn't plan for that. I started writing the series and had, the book ready before Bridgerton ever came out or anything like that. So a lot of it was luck. And, you can, in my case, I was ready to go when luck struck. But, a lot of publishing is a lot of luck.
Christina?
It was so long ago, John.
Well, wasn't your first manuscript one of those trailblazing books about
published manuscript?
I'm talking about the one set in Guatemala.
Well, I was going to tell you, I has that one in Guatemala. There you go. Yeah, it was rejected across the country by agents and editors, and nobody ever wanted it. But I learned a lot. It was one of those books. It took me 6 years to write. I just learned a lot. I bet it was 200,000 words. Honestly, it was my learning book, and by the time I actually got published, I was pretty much on my feet. So,
have time for one more question? Okay.
I mean, when I started, I was a draftsman, and I had taken no writing classes, and all I knew was that I read books by Jane and Krantz, by other authors, and I thought, I can do this. How hard can this be? Which is like the dumbest thing. But also, it's a way a lot of writers get started. And so, yeah, I had to fight my way through a manuscript and learn everything. Romance Writers of America was at the time forming, but it wasn't anywhere close to me. And so I was literally on my own. And I have to say, writing books put me to sleep, so I wasn't reading them. And I learned, and it was hard. And my poor husband, 10 years, and he did finally say, if you don't get published pretty soon, you're going to have to get a job. But you got to say the man was patient.
So can I just have one more follow-up with that with you also? What is your best asset for becoming a better writer? The technique?
Writing. And I don't mean that like flippantly. I really mean the more you write, the better you get. And at least for me personally, the more I write, the more confident I am in myself as a writer. I know what works for me, what works for my process, what causes me maybe to stumble, like the sort of distractions or the sort of pitfalls in my writing process. And I can plan for them. Inevitably, I get to a part in the book where I'm like, why did I ever think I could be a writer? This is so dumb. No one's going to want to read this. And I am just freaking out over this book, and then I look at the word count, like where I'm at in the book. I'm like, oh, that's right. This always happens when I reach 45,000 words. It's okay. Like, it's hard, and I know to power through because I've done it before, because I keep writing. And really, I think that's a big part of it, is to just push through and keep adding words to the page. And the more you do it, the better you get at it, or at least I hope. I'm hoping I'm getting better at it. But yeah, I just keep writing.
Can I answer too? I would say the other side of that is reading. Read a lot. And we were talking about your learning manuscript. I had like 30 years of writing first drafts, so I got the idea of how this worked. But it was always, I would read first. I was a reader first. And then when I got something, I can't really find what I'm looking for, I think I'll go ahead and try and write it. And that's what you do. We just practice, practice, practice.
I think that's a terrific note to end things on. I'd like to thank our 3 authors, Dianne, Liana, and Christina. And thank you, virtual audience here, for joining us for another program at the Poison Pen. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Are we off, Patrick? I'll wait to see before we're off to say something scandalous. Okay.
Way to keep your seats.
Yes. If you give us a few minutes, we're going to get our authors at the table. They'll be happy